Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this week's virtual Noir at the Bar. I'm Vic Watson, the host of Newcastle and Harrogate chapters of Noir at the Bar in real life, whatever that is. Tonight we have readings from Suzy Aspley, Sara Sheridan, Nick Parker, Alex Caan, Heleen Kist, Sarah Jeffery, Isaac Parker, Caroline Dunford, Emma Flint, and our very own IT whiz, Simon Bewick. Yay! As many of you already know, Noir at the Bar started in Philadelphia 12 years ago with Peter Rozovsky, and now lots of us, because of the lockdown, have taken to our computers to make sure that we can still bring you the best in crime fiction. Okay, hashtag VNATB if you want to talk about us on social media. Our numbers are getting amazing. We've got so many of you in here tonight, as you'll be able to see from the bottom of your screen. Due to restrictions, not social distancing, not anything like that, we will have a maximum number of participants. At the moment, we're under that number, but only just. So if you log out tonight and a couple of people jump in, you might not be able to get back in. The reason I've got this Ko-Fi link up here is just to make sure that as we get bigger, hopefully, as we're doing week on week, surprisingly, despite the host being an absolute shambles, we want to make sure that there's enough room for everybody who wants to come. And I do feel that knowing who's coming in the next few weeks, we're going to get even more people wanting to watch. So if you'd usually buy a drink at the bar, I haven't even had a drink, not after last week. If you would usually buy a drink at the bar, please consider just popping a little bit into the Ko-Fi account. It doesn't go to me. Noir at the Bar doesn't make a profit. What it goes to is making sure that as many of us as possible can sit in the room and enjoy the readings from all these amazing writers who've given up their time to keep us entertained during these very, very strange times. Okay, enough begging. On the bottom of your screen is a chat icon. If you want to chat to any of us, or each other in the audience, please do feel free. It is encouraged. That's what Noir at the Bar is about. So when you're in a bar, usually during the breaks, we'll get to have a bit of chat with the writers and stuff. We want to try and replicate that if we can. There's also a Q&A icon. Yes, that's where it is. If you've got any questions for the writers, please do just pop them in the Q&A box and I will endeavour to ask them if I can. We will be selecting winners for free books, as always. If you'd like to enter, please email vnatb20@gmail.com using the subject enter. Just a quick word, Nikki Black, eagle-eyed Nikki Black, is still our chat bouncer. Don't make her use those powers we've given her. She will use them. She's a megalomaniac. So just behave yourselves, okay? As always, please give me a drum roll. I won't be able to hear it, but I'll feel it. And if you hear anything impressive, please do give me a ooh. So without further ado, this is Diet Coke after the hangover that Neil Broadfoot and Rob Parker gave me last week, okay? So I hope you've all got something stronger, but here's to another virtual Noir at the Bar, and let's get the hat out and see who's up first. Okay. Try that again. Right, so it's the IT dude with the mostest, Simon Bewick, just in case you weren't sure. Our very own Simon Bewick worked for Oxford University Press for 25 years before he figured out that they don't publish much in the way of crime fiction. His first published short story received an honourable mention in US editor Ellen Datlow's Year's Best Fantasy and Horror. Woo! Just missing the final selection to some nobody called Stephen King. Since then, Simon's had stories published in print and online magazines, as well as anthologies in the UK, US and Japan. Those stories have been put together in 3 separate collections, 2 horror or dark fiction, 1 for adults and 1 for younger readers, and a set of twist-in-the-tail crime stories which you'll be reading from tonight. His first novel will be published later this year. As I say every week, Simon does an amazing job for us, but I'm so excited to hear his writing. So everybody, please give a huge round of applause to Simon Bewick.
Hello, good evening. Can you hear me all right? I'm looking at my fellow panelists because normally it's me that's going like that. So I'm glad you can hear me. Tonight I'm going to read the first half of a short story from a collection, You Could Make a Killing, which is the mystery twist in the tale. And this half of the story should take you just before you start getting to the twists. So it's called Bedtime Story. Bedtime Story. Tell me a bedtime story, Daddy, my son asked. It's getting late, Daniel, I said, tugging off his hooded jacket. Just a short one. If you get ready for bed quickly. He smiled his beautiful smile and went to work getting his vest off over his head, panicking only a little when it got stuck. What's the story going to be about, Daddy? He asked, pushing blonde hair from his eyes, blowing at the remaining strands ineffectually. I gestured to his Velcro-strapped shoes. What would you like the story to be about? He tugged at the sneakers, his tongue poking out in concentration. Did it? Yeah, now see if you can get your pajama top on. He frowned. I can't do the buttons. I'll help you with them. You just try and get your arms through. As he forced one arm through, the right one, the one that ended in a large white bandage over his hurt hand, he looked up at me. Daddy, why don't you come to see me so often now? He had a knack of doing that, and every innocent question broke my heart. I see you quite often, don't I? Not that often, not every day. No, I don't see you every day, but I speak to you every day on the phone, don't I? He began to nod. Except for last Tuesday. You didn't ring last Tuesday. He had a knack of doing that as well. Forget what he was in the middle of, but remember a small detail from a week ago. But then, maybe a son waiting for his father to ring isn't a small deal. Why can't we live together anymore, Daddy? He asked, his right arm finally finding the other armhole. Well, I said, trying to give him the answer he obviously needed to hear. It's because the court said, isn't it, Daddy? Well, the court, it did what it thought was best. He shook his head. I didn't like that man, that judger man. He scared me. I nodded, remembering the day in court. Daniel had been scared. There'd been tears and there'd been a tantrum. Things had gotten ugly. I tried not to think about that. It hurt too much. You live on your own now, don't you, Daddy? Daniel asked, holding his arms out wide, allowing me to close up the buttons on his pajama top. I thought I heard footsteps outside the door, as though someone were waiting to hear how I answered. Right, so what story would you like? He forgot his question, his face became animated. Bedtime story, a bedtime story. He carried on, an almost musical, almost tuneful chant. To think, this sort of thing used to annoy me when we lived together as a family. By the time I got him into bed, he was in his pajamas and proud he'd gotten the bottoms on by himself. I didn't think it would matter too much they were inside out. He pursed his lips for a kiss. Sometimes he'd do that. Other times he'd make a big show of wiping it off. He could be very affectionate, or he could refuse to be touched. He could be unpredictable. Yeah, he could be unpredictable. What's the story going to be about, Dad? Let me think. Not a scary story, though, Daddy, Daniel said suddenly, his voice vehement, his eyes huge with fear. Danny, are you okay? I don't want a scary story, Daddy. I stroked his hair. Hey, when do I ever tell you a scary story? Ben told me a scary story the other day. I had nightmares. I stroked his hair harder. What did Ben tell you? Danny said, I'm not saying that there were scary things. It's okay, tell me, and I'll speak to Ben, and he won't tell you any more nasty stories. He told me the judge man was going to come to get me. He said, I put a finger to his lips. Shh, it's all right. The judge man, the judge, he isn't really a nasty man, and he's not coming to get you. Don't worry. But that was very naughty of Ben. I'll tell him when I see him, and he won't do it again. My stomach began to churn. The fury started to simmer. I crushed it down. I had a nightmare, Daniel continued, tears leaking out of his eyes now. It's okay, Daniel. Remember what we said? Daniel nodded slightly, and we said it together. Dreams can't hurt you. Dreams aren't true. Go away, bad dreams. You are poo. It worked. A little giggle escaped. The one that crept out when we mentioned willies or bums or poo or wee or snot. Sometimes Daniel was just like any 4-year-old. Sometimes, but not very often. I wiped away the last of his tears and dimmed the small lamp I'd bought for him. Not too much. If he woke up after I'd gone, he'd see the comfort things around him. The Barney poster, the Teletubbies, the Blue's Clues puppy doll. Okay, let's have a story, shall we? I said. Daniel nodded. Can we say a prayer first? This request didn't come up very often. If you want, we can say a prayer. He clasped his hands together. Dear dog, God. He opened one eye and looked at me. Just joking, Daddy. I know, but you shouldn't joke in prayers. He squeezed his eyes back shut. Sorry, God. Dear God, please look after us. Help us to be good. Look after Daddy. He lives on his own now. And please look after Mummy and say hello to her and tell her I love her. Amen. Amen, I said, and my voice only cracked a little. Prayer over, Daniel looked at me earnestly. Story now? I gave a cough and cleared my throat, and it sounded normal when I spoke again. Once upon a time, do all stories start once upon a time, Daddy? Yes. Once upon a time, even the Bible? No, not the Bible. Is the Bible real, Daddy? Yes. I paused. Daniel, do you want to hear the story or not? Yes, Daddy. Okay. Once upon a time, I waited for another interruption, but he let me carry on. There was a big ogre. The ogre lived... What's an ogre? Daniel asked. It's a giant. The ogre giant lived in a big castle, and he lived all alone, just like you. Yes, like me. I thought the story might not be such a good idea, and I didn't even know where it was headed yet. Ben called me a giant, Daniel piped up as I hesitated a moment longer than I should have. Did he? I asked, curious. What did he say? Daniel thought for a moment, searching through his internal recorder. He called me a giant cock-sucking son of a bitch. I swallowed hard. When did he say that, Daniel? Daniel shrugged. He says it all the time. Well, he said, reflecting, a fine point of detail. Sometimes calls me a cock-sucking giant, other times he calls me a son of a bitch, and sometimes he says them all together. He does it when I've been bad. What do you do that's so bad? Like the other day when I hurt my hand with the razor. But that wasn't bad. That was an accident. Daniel shook his head. No, Ben said it was bad. And Ben, oh, no. He clamped his hands, the normal one and the one he'd apparently sliced open with a razor across his mouth. Behind the hands, I could hear him wailing squashed, incomprehensible words. I tried to take his hands away from his mouth, but he didn't want me to. I knew I couldn't force them. It's okay. You're not in trouble. You're not going to get punished for anything. I coaxed for a full 3 minutes before he moved his hands just enough for me to hear him whisper. I'm going to be in trouble. I am. I wasn't supposed to tell about the razor. Ben said he'd be in trouble if I did, and if he got into trouble, I'd get in trouble. I hugged him, feeling his hands creep around to my back, covering it. I gasped slightly as he squeezed me a little too tightly, but I did my best to squeeze him back. He eventually let go of me. I wish Mummy was here. The misery in his voice sliced my heart as cleanly as the razor had cut through his skin. I do too, I said honestly. I do too. Tell me again how she's happy with God and the baby Jesus. I thought you wanted to hear the story of the ogre, the giant. He shook his head violently and his voice dropped an octave. I don't want to hear about the stupid giant. I want to hear about my mummy. It's important to get the right balance between giving in to your children and letting them get away with, well, at certain times, it was simply safer just to do what Daniel wanted. I know that. Okay, Daniel, calm down. It's okay. I'll tell you. So I told him how his mummy was happy in heaven, how she did lovely things every day. I told him her head was normal now and that there wasn't blood anymore and that she watched down on him and that she loved him. I told him again that he'd see her again one day, but not for a long time, and that no, there wasn't anything to be scared of about dying. And I finished by telling him, yet again, that no, his mummy wasn't angry with him for what he'd done. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Simon. Well done. That was excellent. Who's going to follow that then? I hope you're all doing your drum roll at home, although I must point out and say hello to Susan Heads, who is my hat lady in Newcastle. Hello, Susan. I wish you were here. Sara Sheridan is up next. Sara writes the popular 1950s Mirabelle Bevan murder series, as well as historical epic novels set around the world from 1820 to 1845. She's fascinated by female history and recently remapped Scotland according to women's history to memorialise our forgotten foremothers. In 2014, she was named one of the Saltaire Society's 365 most influential Scottish women, past and present. Woo! And is currently working on a novel set in 1820s Edinburgh. Mirabelle's eighth mystery, set in 1958, is out in June and is set in Scotland, where it says where she lives. I guess Sara and Mirabelle, definitely Sara for sure. The new book is called Highland Fling, but tonight Sara is going to be reading from the most recently published Mirabelle, set in 1957 in Brighton, Indian summer. I think that's wrong, isn't it? You've changed it. Oh, you wily one. Everybody, please forgive me and please welcome Sara Sheridan.
It's totally my fault because I changed it over and Fox. So I'm reading from Brighton Bell, which is actually the first Mirabelle Bevan mystery, which is set in 1951 in Brighton. And all you need to know is it's 1951, you're in Brighton, you're in the poshest hotel in Brighton with an older man who's taken a prostitute called Delia into his room. Here we go. There's a huge tub. Would you like to take a bath, Delia suggested, down to the nub of things. We could slip in together. His face lit up. The men loved that kind of thing, champagne and back rubs, baths and room service. Delia knew how to string out the experience for hours. And besides, if she could get a customer into the bath, at least he'd be clean. This customer, like many before him, was more than willing to succumb to the ritual. Yes, a bath. Delia cast her eyes shyly to the ground. She read him exactly right. This man liked a curious mixture of whore and flirtatious innocent. He'd probably have preferred a naughty girlfriend if he could find one, though Delia knew how to play that part. It was a pretense. Such negotiations always were. Will you wash my back? She asked. Yes, he laughed. Delia had never heard him laugh before, at least not like that, without a hint of cruelty. She caught his eye and licked her lips. She'd become very good at appearing to be slightly helpless and naive. In reality, Delia was neither of these things. Her mother had been a doctor and her father a psychiatrist. Between them, they had unwittingly endowed their beautiful daughter with a plethora of information that informed all her relationships, everyone from clients to cleaners, landladies to shop girls, and policemen to rent boys. Delia knew that most of the prostitutes she met were crazy, even at the more cosmopolitan upper end, where she now found herself working. The girls craved money as their only measure of self-worth, and shamelessly manipulated the men who paid for them. This man, however, was not just another oaken wallet to Delia, and she was far from crazy. She had waited a long time and worked hard to find herself in this suite at the Grand Hotel in Brighton in his company, and now she was here, she intended to enjoy herself. I hope they have bath foam, she said lightly, and disappeared into the bathroom to turn on the taps. A waiter came to the door with a bottle of champagne, a pot of coffee, a bowl of fruit and some sandwiches. The old man had thought of everything. Open the bottle, he said, and tipped the boy as he left. He hadn't been looking forward to coming to Brighton. The old man hated the sea, it was too powerful, but he had important business here. He believed in keeping an eye on everything himself. Naturally, he had a wife and children, but he had always frequented prostitutes. One woman was never enough, and besides, his wife was now abroad, and he hadn't seen her in over 3 months. Henrietta was older, as old as he was. He liked possessing her. Some men were squeamish about grey hair and sagging skin, but that didn't matter to him. He loved his wife. Still, it was nice to have a younger woman now and then, if only as a contrast. It made him feel alive. Miss Delia was good, professional, and also beautiful. Even the high-class prostitutes varied, he found, but he could already tell he was going to enjoy himself. Perhaps he'd order her to stay. He would be in Brighton for 10 days. And from what he could see, it was a tiny backwater of a town. He might as well make the best of it. Delia appeared in the doorway of the bathroom wearing peach satin underclothes, sheer stockings, and a pair of high black heels. Her glossy dark hair cascaded over her shoulders. She leaned against the doorframe and posed with one leg against the wood. Come here, he told her. She laughed. My, aren't you bossy? That was the least of it, she knew, but she thought she'd stand up to the old man, give him a thrill. You will come here, he insisted. Delia sashayed into the room. She was naturally slight, her curves undulating and her long legs firm with two tiny moles at her ankle, only just visible through the sheer silk. She knelt in front of him. "What?" she said, with a petted lip, as she looked up. He pulled her towards him by her shoulders and ran his thick fingers over the creamy skin of her stomach, her breasts, her hips, and finally between her thighs. Her skin was as soft as her satin underclothes, and when he fondled her, she sighed. She was very convincing. "I will wash you, you beautiful little whore," the old man directed. "Oh yes," she breathed, and let him pull her towards the bathroom, from which there now emanated a steamy cloud of bergamot scent. After they bathed, the sex was dull. It was only to be expected. Delia normally enjoyed sex, she pondered as he flung her onto the bed. She found she particularly liked having sex with Americans. There were plenty of Americans in London. She had found them to be generous, rich, and well-informed. Perhaps one day she thought she might emigrate to America. Yes, that's what she'd do. She'd live in New York. It would be a fresh start, a splendid idea to put all this behind her and begin a new life. It wouldn't be long now. She moaned encouragingly as the old man turned her over. Lord, old men liked turning her over. At least this would put him into a deep sleep. The Grand Hotel had very nice sheets, lovely, creamy, thick linen. At last, the old man flung himself down on the pillows, mumbling something in another language. Delia spoke most Northern European languages, as well as English. She was fluent in Polish, Danish, Dutch, German. She even had some patchy French. She had an open ear at a young age, and at just the right time had come into contact with a wide variety of native speakers. As a result, she spoke each language with no trace of a foreign accent. Liebe, Henrietta, the old man was saying. That, Delia knew, was the old man's wife. She stroked his head gently. He was falling asleep at last. When he began to snore, Delia slipped out of the bed and poured a cup of cold coffee. She removed her smudged makeup and got dressed. Then she rifled through the old man's pockets. There was some money and a few identification papers. She left all of that, but took a gold coin that she had secreted in his inside pocket. It would be nice to have a souvenir, she thought. Feeling sly, she slipped the coin into hers for later. Delia drew a deep breath. She was ready now. She picked up her suede handbag and carefully drew a needle and syringe from the magenta velvet interior. She knew he would wake up when she punctured his skin. At first, she considered drugging the old man, but had quickly discounted it because drugs would leave traces in the blood. Alcohol was the best thing to slow him down and cause confusion. He'd had a bucketful, and then she'd sat in a hot bath with him, a move designed to enhance his drunkenness. Now, if she injected him, it would look like an embolism. Well, it would be an embolism, but it wouldn't be a natural one. Of course, the doctors would assume it was, especially in a man of this age. There was really very little way to tell the difference if you weren't looking for the signs. Delia considered her options and decided for the last time to administer the injection between the toes. It was easier to hold him down by the legs. The old man sighed in his sleep. She waited, relishing that she was here at last. And then Delia plunged, like a bird of prey, the hypodermic shooting its deadly load into the old man's bloodstream. He woke immediately, shouting and confused. Straight away, Delia refilled the syringe, holding down his calf with her elbow and his foot with the other hand. It would take 2 syringes to do the job, just air, necessary for life, but deadly in the bloodstream. God's little joke, or one of them. She plunged the needle in a second time. "What are you doing?" he shouted. He pulled back as she let go, but it was too late. And then Delia said the words that any old man in his position dreaded hearing. "You don't remember me, do you?" But before he could reply, or even think which one she might be, before he could reason with her or try to explain or run into the hall and get help, the old man found quite suddenly that he couldn't breathe. "Jews," he gasped, his eyes bright with terror. It took 2 minutes. Delia watched him struggling, gasping, pissing himself. A lady she'd met once at a society party in London had remarked that lilies smelled of death. "Makes me quite morbid, my dear, the smell of lilies." The scent now wafted from the crystal vase on the side table, and Delia thought to herself that the lady was wrong. Lilies didn't smell like death at all, not in her experience. At the end, she stood for a long while over the old man's body. A quick end was a luxury he hadn't deserved, but it was the best she could do. Death by natural causes was unheard of. something Delia had never witnessed during the brutal course of her life, but this came close. Bastard. She wanted to spit on him, punch him, but she held back. If they found marks on the body, they would suspect. Instead, she let her emotions course through her. She imagined a blue balloon floating over the ocean outside the window. 2 days before she died, Delia's mother had told her that however many bad people there were, she should never lose faith that there were good people too, in the filth, in the nightmare, when everyone around had lost hope. The good people are everywhere, she promised in a whisper, and you will find them. I promise. Just survive. Neither her father nor her mother would ever have expected Delia to kill the commandant, but from the moment they died, Delia knew that was what she would do. She had been ready to dedicate her entire life to this murder. They called him the Candlemaker. Delia shuddered. Men like that should be hunted like animals and executed. Men like that didn't deserve to live. I did it, Mama, she whispered. I did it. And I am here.
Thank you so much for that. Really enjoyed it. I'm actually going to come back to you, Sara, if you don't mind, because I've had a question from Alex Hawley. Alex would like to know, in these times, do you think that historical crime will become more popular?
Oh God, I hope so. How good would that be? I mean, I think a lot of where we are at the moment, politically and economically in the UK, is about where we come from. You know, and even, you know, going back to Brexit, we've all forgotten about Brexit, of course. But yeah, I think there's a real sense of, you know, we are struggling with somewhere that we've come from, and the 50s is actually a big part of that. And that's one of the reasons I'm interested in writing about it. You know, it's the end of the British Empire, and suddenly everyone's like, well, what's the new world going to be? And it's an issue that we're still kind of struggling with. So I hope so, because I think understanding where you come from is really important to sort of deciding where you want to go. So for me, that's why I'm interested in writing history, any historical story that I write. Good question.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. Okay, so Alex has already used it, but please don't forget we have the, how giant are my fingers, the Q&A button around here. So if you do have any questions for all of our authors tonight, or just one in particular, please do feel free to pop it in there, and I will try and get them to answer it at some point. Our final reader before the first break, Susan, you do this so much better than me, I miss Susan, is Emma Flint. I'm so excited about this. I'm so sorry, but I'm just so excited. Emma Flint grew up in Newcastle upon Tyne, as all the best people do. She has been writing fiction since she knew what stories were. Emma graduated from the University of St Andrews, woo, with an MA in English Language and Literature, woo, later completing a novel writing course at the Faber Academy, also woo. Emma worked in Edinburgh for 4 years and now lives in North London. Since childhood, she's been drawn to true crime stories, developing an encyclopedic knowledge of real-life murder cases. She's equally fascinated by notorious historical figures and by unorthodox women. I'm sensing a theme tonight, and I'm loving it. Little Deaths is her first novel, which I'm sure many of you have read, and Emma is working on her second novel, also a retelling of a real case, but this time set in London in the 1920s. And unless she's changed her mind, I believe that's what we're getting from her tonight. So everybody, huge, huge round of applause to Emma Flint.
Thank you very much. This is my first Noir at the bar. It's amazing to be here, and I've loved what I've heard so far. As Vic said, I'm going to read from my second book, which doesn't have a title yet. Was due to come out next year, but who knows. It's set in 1920s London, and like Little Deaths, it's also based on a real crime. The extract that I'm going to read is from fairly early in the book, and I think all you need to know is that B, short for Beatrice, is the main character and the narrator. She's recently moved to London, and she lives in a ladies' club in Bloomsbury, which was a sort of upmarket hostel for single women. I should also let you know that I may get interrupted by my cat, so I apologise in advance. The other women in the club had been ghosts at first. It seemed as if they vanished just as Bea entered the bathroom, leaving bare, wet footprints on the tiled floor, steam from a bath fogging the mirror, the smell of their talcum powder softening the air, long, coarse hairs clogging the drain or stretching down the wall. These unseen women had been a source of endless fascination and speculation. Hidden away in her room after dinner, pretending to write letters or to darn stockings, Bea would listen to their conversations in the corridor outside and notice that her needle or her pen had fallen still. She came to realize that a woman of 37, used to being careful with her clothes, didn't make much mending anyway. She had no one to write to other than Jane and Maggie, and their letters were so short and so infrequent that she struggled to fill more than a single sheet of paper in reply. She grew tired of these feigned distractions, and then simply curious, and so she began to leave her door open in the evenings, to nod and smile on the staircase and in the dining room, and gradually the women dissolved from a colourful mass of dresses and scent, and heels and high voices, and became distinct and separate. There was Lillian, red-haired and coal-eyed, who trailed scarves in the scent of rich perfume, and who wanted to be a dancer like Isadora Duncan. There were two sisters who were engaged to Canadians, and a quiet girl with black hair and eyebrows and a pure white lock that lay across her forehead like lightning. Bea amused herself by making up stories about them, about the dozens of discarded lovers that beautiful Lillian had left in her wake, about how Annie had disguised herself as a man and fought at the front, and how her white hair was the result of shell shock. These girls were different from any that Bea had met in Newcastle. They were the kind of colourful, bold girls she had half expected to find in London. But she had also found women like her, older women who had come to London alone, just as she had. There was Alice, who blushed often and wore old-fashioned drooping hats and who was taking sculpture classes on Saturday mornings, and her friend Ellen, who had the room across the hallway, and who was unsmiling and clever and surprisingly kind. These were the sort of women that Bea had hoped to find, interesting women who talked about art and politics and ideas. They were women without pretense, who accepted themselves for what they were. Bea imagined that, like her, Ellen and Alice could have stayed at home, could have grown old in the houses where they had been born, could have watched the lines deepen in the faces of their neighbours, and watched the neighbours' children grow and marry and have children of their own. Bea could have kept on just as she was, going to work each day, to church each Sunday, and simply ignored the passing years. She could have gone on dusting the silent rooms each Saturday, rubbing the cloth slowly over the china figures in the front room, over the books and model aeroplanes in George's room. She could have simply let the dust settle each week, wiped it away, and let it settle. When the idea of leaving had first come to her, she had felt a constant guilty ache at the thought of leaving the house where she had last kissed her brother goodbye. But it was outweighed by the sharp pain in her throat, by the taste of iron in her mouth every time she passed George's bedroom door, and every time she soaked herself in the tin bath where he had washed for the last time before he left for France. Every time she shut the front door behind her, she felt that she was losing him all over again, and she couldn't live like this. So she had given her notice at work, and hardly trembled as she handed the letter to Mr. Dearborn, despite her nervousness and her shock at her own daring. She walked out of his office with her head high and her back straight, across the factory floor, and into the ladies' washroom, where she shut herself into a cubicle and gave way to the tears that had been building for days. She heard her mother's voice. "You must have taken leave of your senses, Beatrice Cade." She rested her head against the cool, tiled wall. "Perhaps I have. I've waited long enough to let myself go mad." And then she dried her eyes and blew her nose and dabbed water on her face, And when Ada Patterson came in a moment later and told her how brave she was and how she would never dare do what Bea was doing, she was able to smile and then to walk down the hallway with her shoes riding out a rhythm. Dare to be brave. Dare to be brave. That bravery had lasted her through all the weeks of packing and sorting, through the series of goodbyes and the long train journey, until here at the club she had found relief. Here she need not be brave, and she was not mad. Among these women she was scarcely even odd or remarkable. As the months passed, Bea had grown used to the routines at the club, to the intimacies of cold cream and curlers, to women roaming the corridor in their dressing gowns, and had begun to form her own routines. Now she woke up each morning in a room that was entirely her own, usually curled on her side beneath the eiderdown, with her arm flung over her head, so that her first impressions were the comforting smells of clean cotton and talcum powder, and beneath them, the sweetish, biscuity smell of her skin. When her alarm clock sounded, she would reach for it and silence it, and then stretch, one last, long, luxurious, creaking release, and then get up quickly and pour out her washing water from the jug. The rest was sensation. The shock of cold water, trying not to let the sponge drip down her neck or onto her stomach, the roughness of the towel and the fragrant cloud of talc, the smoothing of cream into her face, the smearing of Vaseline onto her dry lips. Then came her clothes, the softness of cotton, the scratch of wool, the slither of crepe. Sometimes Bea wondered what it would be like to smell of perfume and lipstick grease, her breath to smell of wine and French cigarettes, her room to smell of roses. These were smells that she associated with a kind of womanliness she could not quite define, but felt sure she would be able to identify when she encountered it. Instead, she suspected she smelled mostly of soap, a shining, scrubbed and virtuous smell, and faintly of neglect. Her clothes were clean, but often gave off a very slightly stale odour, as though they had been put away damp. And after her clothes came her shoes, sensible, brown, laced. And then, with the weight of her coat over her arm, she went downstairs, and that was stark, smooth wood under her fingers, the clicking of her heels as she crossed the hall, past the high counter where Mrs. McIver sat all day, frowning above a wealth of black satin and barking directions at the maids. And then on into the dining room where she would nod at the very few people she knew and sit at her usual table in the window overlooking Guildford Street. Hetty would slam down the breakfast tray, and that was cheap white china, chipped and tea-stained, a dull knife dipping into oily margarine, smeary fingerprints on her napkin. And Bea would look out at the men and women hurrying to work and marvel at the life that waited out there. Then she would pour out her own coffee from the jug and stir in milk and sugar, just as she liked it. This was how her day began. This was her place in the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Emma. We've stayed with you because Francesca Carey has asked a question. She says, when writing based on real events or crimes, do you ever feel torn between making a good story and being authentic to the facts?
Yes, is the brief answer. I always tell this story because, so when I started writing Little Deaths, it was my first book and I'd never written anything of that length before. And I'd never written anything based on a true story before. And the case that I wrote about in Little Deaths, the woman at the centre of the story is on trial for the murder of her children. And in the real story, she actually had to go through 3 trials for various reasons. The jury were found they'd done something that meant the verdict was unlawful, and I forget the second one. But she had to go through 3 trials. So I had done all my research and I was very proud of all my research, and I wrote faithfully accounts of 3 trials. And I remember giving the novel to my agent and she said, you've just written the same thing 3 times. Nothing happens. Nothing different happens. So I learned a lot from that, and I still have a tendency, I think, to try and include things because they really happened, and I'm trying to stay true to the story. And I think I probably will always get my editor saying, you know, you need to do something about the suspense here, Emma. You don't need 3 trials or the equivalent. So yeah, the answer is it's a difficult balance, I think, and but I think if you're writing a crime story, I think you've got a responsibility to your readers. You know, when you buy a crime novel, and my books are sold as history, crime, literary fiction, women's fiction, whatever that is. I think if you pick up a crime novel, you're expecting suspense and page turner and a thrill, and you want to be scared. And so I do feel a responsibility to kind of meet that.
Great, thank you. Francesca says thank you so much. That's really helpful background. So that was our first 3 writers. We are now due a break. The bar's looking pretty empty, so we're only going to have a 5-minute break. But I believe there's a quiz for you guys to do if you're really quick back from the bar. So we'll see you in 5 minutes. Thank you very much. Hi, did you get them right? I had to duck out and go to the bar for Iron Brew because Rob Parker and Neil Broadfoot broke me, and Effie Merrill. Let's not forget her. She's a bugger. Anyway, thank you very much, everybody, for staying with us. And we have had quite a few donations to that website to help us try and expand the room capacity. So thank you very much to everyone who's donated. There is no pressure on anyone to donate, and we don't make a bean off this. But thank you truly to everybody who has, because it's helping us reach more people and you know, hopefully make Wednesday nights a bit more bearable or unbearable. I don't know. Okay, so we're going to have 4 readers before the next break. And the first lucky reader is Suzy Aspley. South Shields born Suzy Aspley started her book after a writing prompt, 6 human teeth in a matchbox. The prompt reminded her of a story she once covered as a reporter. She's lived in Scotland for more than 25 years and was a journalist on a regional newspaper for more than a decade. She now works in communications in the NHS. So first of all, hero. I mean, you are my hero anyway, Suzy, but yeah, doubly so. Terrified at the thought of pitching, but encouraged by her friend Mari Hannah. That's 2 weeks Mari Hannah's been mentioned for being massively encouraging and supportive to people. So how lovely is that? And I think you all know the crime fiction world is super supportive. So having been encouraged by Mari, Suzy took the plunge at Thixton's last summer and stuck her name in the hat. It was picked out first, and shaking like a leaf but wearing her lucky tartan trainers, she won over the 4 panellists in Dragon's Pen. Then, in September, she won Bloody Scotland's Pitch Perfect competition and was shortlisted as a new writer at the inaugural Capital Crime Festival. Can I get a whoop whoop? You had a successful year last year. 2020, Suzy claims, hasn't been quite so good yet. I guess written for the NHS, that's an understatement. She's reading the opening of her debut novel, One for Sorrow, which is currently out for submission. So everybody, the wonderful, magnificent Suzy Aspley.
Thanks very much, Vic. Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? I can't hear anybody, so that's fine. Anyway, right, here goes. So I'm going to read the prologue, which is quite short, and an edited version of chapter 1. And if there's any agents out there, I'm looking, so thanks. Okay. Silhouetted in the trees outside, the large black birds call loudly, reminding her of that night. She's heard some say crows are the souls of murder victims, that they warn of evil to come. She shivers, instinctively reaching into her pocket, searching for the precious box that's always tucked safely against her heart. Her fingers catch the rough edge as she slides it open, swallowing hard against the lump blooming in her throat. Carefully unwrapping the contents, scared of what's inside. If only she'd been there, if only she could hold them one last time. A tear spills down her cheek, drops silently onto the cloth. She lifts the matchbox to her face, hopes their scent might still hide amongst the folds, a torn edge off their blue blanket. Gently strokes the tiny teeth, grey tinged with ash, but still perfect, nestled like fragile eggs in the soft velvet. It's all she has left to love, to remember them. If only she could bring them back. If only. Chapter 1. Blood pounded in his ears as Fraser set off up the steep hill through the village. He ran every morning before school, loved the feeling it gave him. Every muscle ached and throbbed, his chest tight as he gulped in the air, the beer from last night's party still swirling through his system. Alcohol fuzz on his teeth and the musky scent of the girl he'd been kissing still in his hair. He smiled at the thought. He'd run the 6K route down Station Road, doubling back along deserted forestry trails across the meadow before coming home through the Black Wood. Fraser yearned for adventure. When he got back, a quick shower and breakfast. Mum would have the bacon on before he was out of the bathroom. He could almost smell its smoky aroma and hear the sizzle of fat in the pan as he pounded on. Off the road now, he turned up through the trees, along a short grassy track, his running shoes keeping him upright on the uneven ground. Early morning runs were a chance to dream of all the places he'd go once school was finished and he was free. The trail wound its way over the oak wood where the fairy tree stood. There was no one there now, but later visitors would flock out from Aberfoyle, bringing small kids armed with ribbons and bells to tie to the giant oak tree as an offering to the little folk. Mum used to bring him and his brother Joe when they were wee. Despite the AirPods in his ears, he could hear the wind chimes on the breeze. Around him, copper-fringed bracken had grown so high over the summer that places where at the start of the year you could see for miles were now completely hidden. His playlist was doing the trick, music chosen for a good running rhythm. He was invincible, 17 years old and the world at his feet. Boom, 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 heart and drumbeat in synchronicity. Rounding the next corner, the hills snaked away into the distance. He took off at a sprint along the left fork of the track towards home. Without warning, Fraser felt something suddenly hard against his shin and down he went, crashing into the gravel track. The wind knocked right out of him as he rolled. "What the hell?" he cried out, hitting the ground hard, stones cutting sharply into his bare flesh. Disorientated, he lay panting for a second, his music now distant where the headphones had dropped to the ground. He stared at the sky as clouds passed fast overhead. Then he heard the whine of an engine coming closer through the trees. Thank God for that, he thought. Pulling himself upright, a man appeared riding an ancient quad bike which belched diesel fumes into the morning air. Fraser felt a rush of gratitude that someone was out this early. A big bloke dressed in a heavy green jacket and waterproof trousers, a cap pulled down over his head. Wraparound tinted glasses concealed his eyes. "You all right, lad?" he called as he approached. He pulled up close to where Fraser was sitting, cut the engine and got off the bike. "It's early to be out here." He had a deep voice, somehow familiar, but the boy wasn't sure whether he recognised the old man. He seemed friendly enough and had just come at the right moment. He handed over a bottle of water, cold against Fraser's grazed fingers. "Have a drink. Looks like you could do with a hand," he said. Fraser glanced down. His knees were impregnated with grit, mud mixed with rivulets of blood running down his shins. He took the drink gratefully, felt the cool liquid pour down his throat. Then he noticed a thick green robe lying across the track. "Shit, who the hell put that there?" he said. The man pulled a large bone-handled knife out from his belt, the blade glinting in the early morning sun. He sliced easily through the fibre. "Someone's been playing tricks. You get all sorts out here. Come on, I'll give you a lift back to the village," he said. He offered Fraser a strong arm to pull him upright. The boy swayed, his head spinning wildly as he got to his feet. The fall must have affected him more than he'd thought. "Never mind, I'll get you back now," the man said, lacing his arms beneath Fraser's armpits and taking his weight as he helped him towards the trailer. A pile of old blankets and a tarpaulin lay in the back, and Fraser was grateful for the lift. He settled in and listened to the engine roar back into life, the diesel fumes snaking into his nose now as they moved off into the forest. "You drink the rest of that water. It'll make you feel better," the man called. Fraser gulped it down, but felt sick as he lay back and drifted off. The driver looked behind and smiled to himself. Everything was going according to plan. He put the quad into gear and took the track away from the village and deeper into the heart of the forest. Fraser opened his eyes. He couldn't see properly. His vision blurred, making him confused in the dim light. Birds called outside, shrieking. He remembered running and a fall. His whole body ached and his head felt weird, spinning as though he'd been drinking. He hadn't had enough last night to cause a hangover, just a few beers, but his throat was dry and he could taste something odd, metallic. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he could smell something awful. "What the fuck? Where am I?" His words slurred. There was a slight blast of air as a door opened, bringing sudden light to illuminate the place. Through the haze of his delayed reaction, he could see he was in some kind of shed. The horrible rotting smell was more intense now, so bad he could taste it. Not far from where he lay, a heap of dead birds was piled against the wall. Black, shining feathers streaked with dried blood, their opaque eyes staring and little legs sticking out stiffly from the awful pile. Their beaks were open as if gasping to breathe or call out for help. He recoiled, trying to pull himself further back, but a feeble body wouldn't do what his head was telling it to. Even for a teenager used to watching zombie TV shows on Netflix, this was a ghoulish sight. Why would anyone keep piles of dead crows in a shed? "Help me," he said, voice laced with fear. He realised someone must have come in when the door opened and tried to look around. Fraser's words drawled as his brain couldn't properly comprehend what he saw, smelled or heard. Was this a nightmare? Then bang! A sudden searing pain as something hard hit him in the side of his head. A dark, unrecognised figure loomed over him. He felt a sharp scratch in his arm, as though he'd been stabbed. Then blackness overwhelmed him. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. You are getting some major love, Suzy, and rightly so. Just a quick reminder, folks, we've got the Q&A there. If you've got any questions for any of the writers or all of them, please do feel free. The lovely thing about Zoom is, when I do Newcastle or Harrogate, I don't get the opportunity to do Q&A, which is actually how Noir at the Bar started. Peter Rozovsky invited one writer to read a very short piece, and then he would ask them some questions, and then he'd get the audience to ask them some questions. So really, with Zoom, we're kind of going back or meeting in the middle of the original Noir at the Bar. So it's really lovely. Please don't be frightened. Just ask the questions. Obviously, writing on book related if you can, you know. So the Ratty Tatty hat is out, and we have Heleen Kist. Yes, Heleen Kist is a Dutch author living in Glasgow, and I've probably just butchered her name, so my apologies. She was a Crime in the Spotlight author at Bloody Scotland 2018, woo, with her first novel, In Servitude. This won the Silver Medal for Best European Fiction at the Independent Publishers Book Awards in the USA, and was shortlisted for the Selfies Award at London Book Fair. Woo! Tonight she's reading from Stay Mad, Sweetheart, a feminist tale of revenge that she wrote fed up with being fondled, patronised and ordered to smile by random men. It was published in November 2019 by up-and-coming indie press, Red Dog Press. So everybody, please give a huge round of applause to Heleen Kist.
Thank you very much. Hi, so I'm reading from Stay Mad, Sweetheart. And I was planning on reading another bit, but then Suzy really creeped me out. So I think we need something slightly more lighthearted even. So I'm going to start with chapter 1, which is Laura, who is the main character. A tear fell onto the page of my book in a star-shaped splotch. I wiped it with my thumb. The stationery cupboard's dry, inky air tickled my throat as I sighed. Those poor people. The photocopier vibrated against my back, mirroring the movement of the novel's train carriage, its heat evocative of the bodies pressed together, its persistent humming an echo of the stoic prayers uttered by the captives being transported to their final destination. I hated to leave them, but my time was up. I waved the still damp page side to side and blew the coldest air that I could onto it. The translucent spot rippled the paper. I closed the book and held it to my chest, stroking its edges. It wasn't the first one I'd ruined this way. I heard giggling. The door clicked open. I froze. Restless rustling of fabric, the smacking wetness of lips, and baritone groans filled the tiny space. Crap. Hurry up, said the woman. The man whispered, let me help. It may only have been seconds, but the intensified moans suggested they were being well spent. I shrunk into my slot between the photocopier and the side wall, forced to listen to the unmistakable swoosh of skirt lining against tights, the metal tear of a zipper, and the thud and tinkle of a belt buckle hitting the floor. The room's flimsy rear partition shook against my shoulder. Through a small gap, I saw snippets of skin, her braceleted arms outstretched above her head, the tips of his fingers digging into their wrist. I looked away. Beside me, rattled pens rolled towards the edge of a metal shelf. I willed them to stay put. Her voice again, breathless. I have a better idea, she cooed. Help me up. I stiffened. Up? The man grunted. The photocopier creaked and a cascade of red curls fell over the side of the machine onto my head. Definitely Sally. But who was he? I winced. I preferred not to know. But what if they saw me? They'd think I was some sort of pervert. Steeling myself for intense awkwardness, I cleared my throat. Twice. What the? Said the guy. The mass of hair bounced out of view. My knees complained as I rose. Sorry, I was reading. Oh my God, Laura, if I'd known. Sally hopped off the machine, clutching the panels of her blouse. She swooped down to pick up her skirt, not realizing that swift move exposed me to a full frontal of the newest data science recruit, his stunned face up top and trousers bunched around his ankles below. My blush felt incandescent. I covered my eyes to let the interrupted lovebirds regain their modesty, the three of us developing an unspoken understanding that this never happened. As the door closed behind them, I caught his worried murmur, "Do you think she saw it?" And her replying with a chuckle, "If she did, it will have been her first." Though it was true, it was unnecessary. I crouched to retrieve the book from my rudely invaded personal haven. The guy's head popped back in. I jumped, hitting my shoulder against the shelf. "Forgot to tell you," he smiled meekly. "Justin is looking for you." The filter water dispenser in the corridor provided me with much needed cooling down. The heat receded from my cheeks, but immediately fired up again as I saw the clock overhead and stress took hold. I was late. How did I let time slip away? I grabbed my phone for my regular check-in with Emily, my best friend. The line rang out. I let out a high-pitched whine, torn between wanting to wait to try again and rushing to Justin's supposedly mission-critical meeting. I walked on. 5 colleagues huddled ahead of me, deep in discussion, drawing flowcharts with black marker pens on long length of wall coated with special wipeable paint. One of them spotted me approaching. He nudged another. Their semicircle fell silent and broke open, revealing their work. Hopeful faces sought my contribution, my approval. I passed them with a brisk pace and my most courteous smile. I dialed Emily again as I strode past rows of desks, their occupants tip-tapping away at their keyboards, their screens faded by the rays of a rare distant sun, the Scottish sun. This time her line was engaged. Please God, let them not have found her mobile number too. In the lobby, the multicolored logo of Empisoft stretched across the surface behind the reception desk. Underneath, a shelf showcased our many technology awards, oversized engraved dust gatherers bearing testament to our team's hard work. Next to them, an embarrassingly large photo of Justin and me, holding yet another trophy, my thin smile doing its best, my eyes missing the lens by a mile. Liv stood watering the plant next to the visitor's TV, tuned to the non-stop horrors of the outside world. She dried her hands on her cardigan and flashed a motherly smile. There you are. Dose of book time again? I nodded, ready to speed on, but my eyeline flicked to the 60-inch screen. Adam Mooney, the Hollywood star, was exiting Edinburgh's Festival Theatre and making his way down its stone steps. Saliva flooded my mouth in revulsion. A sea of outstretched arms shoved microphones towards his angular jaw as reporters pelted him with questions. How do you respond to calls for your arrest for sexual assault? I spotted errors in the closed caption transcription. Too many voices, but it perfectly captured his response. No comment. Liv stood at my side. That's a real tearjerker, isn't it? What? You feel sorry for him? I asked. No, your book. The concentration camps. Oh, I looked down at the blue and white striped cover. Yes. I do feel a bit sorry for him, though. Liv gazed back at the screen. It's so easy for this kind of thing to destroy a career. I'm not convinced he deserves to suffer like that. I spun towards the boardroom. I don't think he can suffer enough. That's it.
Thank you, Heleen. I'm going to come back to you because Alex Hawley would like to know what was the inspiration for the scene you've just read?
I have not had sex in a cupboard ever at work. I thought it would be an interesting way to set the scene for my character, who is a very bookish and shy woman, but actually she founded a technology startup, a data science company, and the technology actually takes quite an important role in the book. So it's a suspense novel, it's a feminist thriller, but it's also a bit of a techno thriller. You don't need to understand the technology. So I wanted to show the, the kind of nerdiness of her and the insecurity and the virginity of her. And also it kind of obviously talks about a Hollywood actor being accused of sexual assault, which is a hugely topical topic and something that again plays a fairly prominent role in the book.
Excellent, thank you. And Francesca Carey has asked, well, she said, this might sound like a really weird question, but you have quite an expressive face when you read. And someone else has actually mentioned it on Twitter as well. Francesca thinks your expressive face is fab. She says, do you find yourself making faces at your screen when you're writing and trying to find the words?
I don't know, because I don't watch myself, but I do know that I grab the air when I can't come up with a word or I'm looking for an idea. I'll be standing like this. I actually have a standing desk. And there's quite a lot of grabbing going on.
Excellent. Just like in your excerpt. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
That was brilliant. Thank you so much. And the book's getting a lot of love in our chat thing there. Don't forget Q&A's just there, I think. #VNATB, and if you want to be entered to win a free book, just drop me an email with the subject line enter. And next out is Sarah Jeffery. Sarah Jeffery is a member of my writing group, first of all. Not that any of you care about that. She's a phenomenal writer. She's a former journalist and lecturer who now works in PR. Started writing creatively in 2013 and has written a first draft of a novel and several short stories. 3 of her stories have been published in anthologies from the Writers' Playground, while another is featured in Sisterhood by Elementary Writers. In 2019, Sarah came second in North Tyneside Library's Storytime competition and was longlisted for New Adventures, Maybe it'd be better if I had a drink. Sorry, Sarah. New Adventures, New Voices competition, with her current work in progress the following. This year, she was shortlisted again for Storytime and was chosen to showcase her work online as part of the Stay-at-Home Literature Festival. Jesus, I'm so sorry. Thanks to the lovely Carolyn Jess Cook. So, without further ado from Mumbles over here, everybody, here's the fab Sarah Jeffery.
Thank you. Can you all hear me as well? Good. I'm actually just going to read quite a short extract from a short story called Blood Sisters. A loud scream pierces the cold November night. Cries of help come through the air. It's pitch black as Jess navigates herself through the park. There's a faint smell of cigarette smoke in the air. Someone is close. Up ahead, she can make out 2 people, one standing and one crouching. As she gets closer, she can see it's 2 girls around her age, and the one on the ground is getting a good beating. "Get off me! Leave me alone!" she shouts. There's no reply from her attacker, who aims another blow at the girl's head. As her fist hits the girl's jaw, it makes her head jolt. The sound of the impact reminds Jess of her old boxing lessons. She knows the victim will have a ringing sensation in her ears, and her head will be pounding. Why isn't she trying to defend herself? "Please, stop, I'm begging you," the girl whines. "I haven't done anything." She cowers on the wet tarmac of the playground with her hands raised. A flash of blonde hair and a bright orange battered leather jacket roots Jess to the spot. She would recognise it anywhere. Instantly, she knows the attacker is her best friend, Ruby. "You're pathetic, you stupid bitch," Ruby spits as she thumps the girl again. "You've crossed the line now, and you're going to pay for it." "I don't know what you mean," the victim wails. "Then you're more stupid than I thought." Jess is stunned. She's never seen Ruby lash out like this before. There's been plenty of fights over the years. It's all part of growing up on the Darwin estate. But this is different. Ruby is out of control. Jess can't watch anymore. She has to do something. She moves closer, trying to catch her friend's attention. She's sickened by what she sees. The girl on the ground is Sharon Rogers, who is cowering on the floor, lying curled up in a fetal position, trying to protect herself from Ruby's blows. Sharon is battered and bloodied, but Jess can't see how badly injured she is. Ruby is towering over her, holding on to Sharon's lank dark hair, waiting to deliver another blow. Jess steps out of the shadows. What the fuck is going on? I'm teaching this silly bitch a lesson, Ruby yells. She should know better than to flirt with other girls' boyfriends. You're doing this because she was talking to Danny? Jess shakes her head in disbelief. When it comes to Danny Brown, Ruby won't listen. She's totally in love with him. God only knows why. He's an average-looking 20-year-old no-hoper who thinks he's God's gift. Ruby glares at Jess. Don't be fucking stupid. She's been flirting with him for weeks, then had the bloody nerve to ask him out, telling him to dump me. Did Danny tell you that? Well, yeah. Who else? Right. And you believe him? Jess clenches her hands by her side to stop herself from trying to shake some sense into Ruby. Of course. Why? What are you getting at? Ruby says. Jess recognises the familiar accusatory tone, daring her to disagree. She knows this isn't the time to tell Ruby what she really thinks of Danny. She doesn't want to make the situation any worse. Maybe he was winding you up, Jess says. He could have been lying. No, he wasn't. He wouldn't lie to me. He loves me. Sharon whimpers on the damp ground and tries to lift her head up. Her hair is matted with blood and stuck to her battered face. She's virtually unrecognisable. Without getting any closer, Jess knows she's seriously hurt. No, he doesn't. He only loves himself, she whispers through her swollen lips. Jess sighs. Nobody back answers Ruby. Her best friend spins back around, towering over Sharon's crumpled body. She yanks her hair, pulling her head off the ground, and starts kicking again, each blow more ferocious than the one before. Sirens ring in the distance, and Jess sees the faint blue glow of emergency vehicles through the trees. Shit. Someone's called the cops, Jess shouts. Come on, Ruby, we need to go. It's no good. Ruby isn't going anywhere. She always has to finish what she started. Jess can't stomach any more. She heads off back the way she came. Ruby's gone too far this time. She's out of control, and Jess no longer recognises her best friend. Her heart hammers against her ribs as she struggles for breath. A wave of nausea washes over her, and she has to force back the bile that's creeping up her throat. She doesn't know what to do. She's no snitch, but Ruby can't get away with this. As the police enter the park, Jess hides in the shadows, hoping Ruby is behind her, but she's not. A final cry echoes through the park, followed by a loud thud. Jess will never forget the sound of Ruby delivering the final fatal blow. And that's it. And I really apologise because I forgot to mention that there was swearing in it before I started. So sorry for that if anyone was offended. I started reading it and going, I can't stop now, and sort of apologise in advance. So sorry.
Fret not. Fret not. I'm sure there'll be complaints. The bill's in the post. Oh, this just fell out of the hat. Susan, by the way, depending on how long this lasts, I don't know if the hat's going to make it.
Need a new one.
I'm just putting it out there now, Susan. You may need to replace it. I'll try my best. And our final reader of this bit is Caroline Dunford. Where am I? Here I am. Having previously worked as a journalist, another journalist, there's journalists in crime fiction all over the place. We've had Sarah Jeffery, last week there was Neil Broadfoot, now we've got Caroline Dunford. Caroline Dunford also worked as a psychotherapist and helped many people shape their personal life stories before taking the plunge and writing her own stories. She's now published almost 30 books in varying genres, ranging from historical crime to thrillers and romance, including her much-loved Euphemia Martin's Mysteries, and a new series set around World War II featuring Euphemia's perceptive daughter, Hope Stapleford. Caroline also teaches creative writing courses part-time at the University of Edinburgh it is my delight to welcome Caroline Dunford.
Hi, I'm going to read to you from one of the latest Euphemia Martin's, which is A Death at the Races. This is the 14th book in the series, but you can really start anywhere, as I hope I will prove. And it's about the point when Euphemia has finally got married. She has been trying to get married for most of the last 14 books, just not particularly successfully and not always to the right person. But now she's married a man who's definitely her partner in life and everything should be going smoothly. It is the start of 1914 and they have just arrived back from honeymoon to their house and their butler is called Giles. "It appears we have a visitor," said my new husband. "Not tonight," I said. "Giles should have refused them." Apparently he tried, but to no avail. Bertram's upper lip was looking uncommonly stiff. "Who on earth is it?" "He refused to give his name, but I rather suspect." As if waiting for his cue, our visitor erupted out of the library door. "It's rather late, you know," he said. "Poor Giles was beginning to worry. You could have telephoned him. You do know I had a telephone put in, don't you? It's my wedding present to you. I'm sure you'll both find it very useful living out here in the middle of nowhere. May I kiss the bride?" And with that, he darted towards me, and before I could step back, put a hand on each shoulder and planted a firm kiss on each cheek. "Fitzroy," I said wearily. "Fitzroy!" cried Bertram. "What the devil do you mean by showing up here tonight of all nights?" The spy smiled charmingly and tilted his head on one side. "I don't suppose you would accept I merely happened to be passing?" "On a filthy night like this, in the middle of nowhere," said Bertram. By now I could see he was beginning to quiver with rage. "I wanted to give you my best for your future happiness." "Fitzroy," said Bertram in a low voice and through gritted teeth. "Oh, very well," said Fitzroy, shrugging. "I needed to speak to Euphemia as it happened. I was nearby. Can't tell you where or why." He smiled again, perfectly at ease in invading our home this late at night. Bertram turned to me. I thought I had made it perfectly clear that we were to have no more dealings with this man. "Heavens, Euphemia," said Fitzroy. "You're barely married a moment and he's gone all dictatorial." Bertram flushed slightly red. "I mean, I thought we had agreed this chapter of our lives had closed." Fitzroy looked from him to me, clearly enjoying the situation. "I take it you haven't told him yet." "Told me what?" said Bertram. Having been flushed, he suddenly paled. "It was a real vicar that married us, wasn't it? It wasn't one of his ploys." "Honestly, Bertram," I said, taking the high ground while I still could, "we have been living as man and wife for a week. Do you think I would?" Bertram went back to being flushed. No, of course not," he said. "It's just that with that dastardly fellow, one never knows where one stands." "The dastardly fellow is still here," said Fitzroy. We both ignored him. "You're quite correct in saying that I wanted to close this chapter of our life upon our marriage," I said. Fitzroy staggered dramatically as if shot, one hand pressed to his chest. We both continued to ignore him. "However, that was before I was charged with murder." "Well, yes," said Bertram. It may have been a trick of the firelight, but the loving look in his eyes appeared slightly diminished. His tone was certainly wary. I looked over at Fitzroy. "I take it I can tell him now." "As long as Giles isn't lurking in the shadows," said the spy. "He wouldn't let me tell you until we were married," I said in a rush. "I wanted to, but he made me promise and I couldn't." Bertram held up his hand. "This man has some hold over you?" he asked. "You give your obedience to him over your own husband?" "Oh, no," said Fitzroy. "She's never been obedient with me. Reluctantly compliant, aggressively acquiescent, contemptuous. Which is best applied, Euphemia?" "If you could stop enjoying yourself for a minute and let me explain," I snapped. "Go back into the library. I wish to speak to my husband alone." Fitzroy gave a mock bow. Then he threw me a wink behind Bertram's back that I interpreted as a sign that he would be listening in. "So," said Bertram, as the door closed behind the spy. I sighed. "So, when I was arrested for murder, Fitzroy offered me 2 ways out of the mess. One was to flee abroad. What? Exploded Bertram. Oh, no, not like that. He doesn't think of me in any romantic way. I'm useful to him, that's all. How? As an asset, I said, nothing more. Or it was nothing more. Euphemia, if you don't stop prevaricating and spit it out, I swear I will take that umbrella over there and go into the library and thrash that man. I could almost hear the eavesdropper thinking, you can try. I joined the intelligence service, I said, as an agent of the Crown. I'm only allowed to tell one person, and Fitzroy said, as I keep almost getting married, I shouldn't tell you until after we were. I agreed, and I'd rather not told you at all. Is that all? Said Bertram. What do you mean? You're a spy now. It always seems to me that when you were doing the lion's share of the work whenever we were involved with him. I can't see how it would be different. I took an oath, I said, to protect king and country. Of course, I've expected nothing less of you. We both tried to do our bit. You don't understand. He's my superior now. Bertram looked at me blankly. I have to follow his orders. At this point, he strode over to the stand and lifted the umbrella. Thinks he can order my wife about? Well, I'll damn well show him. I put my hand out to stop him. But he can. That was my forced-in bargain. It was the only way he could legally get me out of custody. Bertram paused. Since when has obeying the law mattered to that man? I was publicly accused of murder. Short of spiriting me out of the country, there was nothing he could do to save me from being hanged. The evidence, though largely circumstantial, was compelling enough for most juries. I'd never have let that happen, said Bertram. I walked up to him and gently took the umbrella from his grasp. I didn't do this without considerable thought, I said. He explained in detail what it would mean for me and my future. If anything, he tried to talk me out of accepting. No, he wanted you to run away with him. How can you say that after he saved your nephew and nieces, not once but twice? I don't always like the way he behaves, but he does good in the end. You know that. Bertram made a gruff sound, like a bear that had hit its head on the roof of its own cave. What does it mean? He asked. It means I am required to do something for king and country, then I must obey. Bertram gave a deep sigh, echoing my own earlier one. I suppose that's not so bad. I mean, on occasion, it was almost fun. And together. I shook my head. No, only I took the oath. Well, I'll take the damn thing too. I held out my hands to him. He took them. I raised his cold right hand to my lips and kissed them. You know I love you. But, said Bertram, his body taut with tension. I asked Fitzroy at the time, and he said, because it was a military outfit, you could not be admitted due to your health. Bertram bristled like an indignant hedgehog. I am hardly ever ill. Besides, I cannot have my wife going into danger alone. I won't be alone, at least not for my first few missions. A heavy silence fell between us. I swallowed. You mean? Said Bertram. I nodded. I'll be with Fitzroy. Bertram withdrew his hands from my grip. I see, he said in a tight voice. Well, while you attend to your guest, I shall retire. I opened my mouth, but he held up his hand in a most aggressive manner. You have explained. There is nothing more to be said. I must accept the situation. I must accept that my wife dances to the tune of another man. He went for the staircase without another word and mounted it swiftly. I stood there stunned. This was not the homecoming I had wished for. Fitzroy poked his head around the edge of the library door. Well, I think we can say that went about as well as we expected. It was with great difficulty that I prevented myself from picking up the nearest vase and throwing it at his head.
Thank you so much. I loved that. That was brilliant. And you are getting a lot of love in the chat as well. Thank you so much, Caroline. We are going back to the bar. So 5 minutes to get yourselves a drink, maybe throw some money that way, maybe enter our competition, maybe go on social media and talk about us. Who am I to say what you should do with these 5 minutes? We'll see you very, very shortly. Thank you. welcome back. It's the last part. I must say hello to everybody. We've got a few people viewing from America tonight, and actually next week we do actually have a reader from America joining us. Some of you who've been to Noir at the Bar in Newcastle might have an inkling who it is, but I can tell you, oh, I've just seen Sarah Jeffrey's face. I can tell you, you are in for such a treat next week, as you have been every week. But just, I wish you could have seen Sarah's reaction there, because I think everybody will just feel exactly the same once you hear this reader. So, who's next? Somebody who's joining us from Germany tonight, Nick Parker. My lovely friend Nick Parker has a love for the horror genre that flourished in early childhood. She enjoyed the opulence of genre productions in the 80s, chasing forbidden video nasties with friends and reading mainly Clive Barker and Stephen King. Since her 20s, she's had the pleasure of meeting and interviewing many household names from the horror genre in her role as a journalist for Movie Star magazine. Ooh, another journalist. I'm just going to start keeping a tally here, I think. Nick is an avid book collector, passionate about art, and likes to try out new recipes from her many cookbooks. She lives in rural Germany with her husband, enslaved by many cats who may be making an appearance this evening. I don't know. Descent to Hell is the first part in the Hell trilogy with main character Charlie Ward. So everybody, all the way from Germany, please welcome Nick Parker.
Thanks a lot, people. Good evening. Nice to see you. I'm doing the Dr. Evil see you. Okay, so I decided not to read from the horror novel, because maybe that's not the genre for everybody. And I recently wrote a short story. It's really very short. It's not even 3 pages. And so I'm not saying anything about it beforehand, and I'm just going to start to read. And I'm going to do the Dr. Evil again. So it's going to be a world premiere. The story is called Mrs. Miller's Muffins. Young Toby stood on the couch, looking out the window and waving at Mrs. Miller, who walked down the small pathway that led to their home. He turned around to his dad. "Is Mrs. Miller sad, Daddy?" Kyle Hansen ruffled his son's hair, the rich auburn inherited from his late mother. Cheryl had not only been the love of Kyle's life, he still missed her every day. Lately, he had noticed many things in Toby that reminded him of her. He didn't know if Toby had picked up gestures and mannerisms of his mom, or if somehow Cheryl wanted to let Kyle know she was still around in some way. Kyle sighed. "Yeah, she is. Why is she sad, Daddy?" Kyle kissed the crown of his son's head. "She also lost someone, Toby. Her husband died, and soon it's the anniversary of his death again." Toby nodded, his young face understanding, and like he carried the weight of the world on his small shoulders. Toby jumped off the couch and walked straight to the kitchen table. "At least she has Dr. Whiskers." Kyle smiled. Dr. Whiskers. Mrs. Miller once told him she had given her cat that name because the pet had been a godsend after the death of her husband. The cat had worked like an antidepressant for her, she had said. Kyle went to the table where Toby had already started to pick little pieces of one of the chocolate muffins Mrs. Miller had brought for them. Her muffins were simply the very best, no doubt about it. Many single and married female neighbors had brought Kyle muffins and baked goods after his wife had died. Alas, most had been generic cake mixes, tasteless, lifeless, soulless. Mrs. Miller's muffins, though, they tasted like heaven, rich in chocolate with added butter and eggs, and not just powder you added water to. They were made with passion and love. Before he knew it, Kyle sat down and reached for a muffin, a signal for Toby to grab one from the plate with his small hand. They both looked at each other, big grins on their faces. Mrs. Miller exhaled after she had closed the latch of the gate of the low white picket fence of the Hansons' house. How clean Kyle kept everything. He had even preserved the luscious blooms his pretty wife had always been so proud of. Kyle had asked her for her expertise when his wife had died, and she had shown him how to mend the roses. Kyle and Toby were the last family she had delivered her muffins to. The two had been ecstatic to receive them, like always, their smiles wide and genuine. She would miss those two faces. She would miss all of the people in her neighborhood, the Carsons next door to her, a black family everyone had been cautious of when they had first moved in, yet they had proved to be invaluable members of the community. The parents both helpful and the kids polite and so smart they both would have gone to university. She realized she sighed when she passed the home of Charlotte and Clarissa Kellerman, two elderly sisters with whom she had spent many wonderful evenings playing cards and mixing too many margaritas. The flow of alcohol had always led to dirty talk about men, and they had always ended up giggling like teenagers. When she reached her home, which was right at the end of the cul-de-sac, she turned around and took in her beloved neighborhood. 40 years she had lived here, had seen people come and go, new members of the community being born, and loved ones leaving or dying. She had kept them all in her heart. She had helped where she could, baking to raise money for the community, and babysitting when parents needed a night out. When families had found themselves in dire straits, she had lent them money without interest, and everyone had always paid her back to the last dime. She had tried not to look too sad when she had delivered her muffins, and, like expected, everyone had welcomed her for a chat. Only she knew it had been the last chat ever. Oh well, there was no way back now. She opened the door to her house and, like she had done countless times before, carefully put the keys in the small porcelain dish on the slim sideboard. Her gaze fell upon Dr. Whiskers, curled up in his small basket like he was asleep. She had made her decision after the call from her oncologist this morning. The words had blurred into some kind of static, with only a few scraps of the conversation reaching her consciousness. Sorry, beyond treatment, hospice. She remembered having thanked Dr. Murray like an autopilot. She had reassured him she would call him back to tell him what she had decided. Then she had wondered why Dr. Whiskers had not shown up for his breakfast yet. She had found him in the basket, curled into his favorite blanket. She had not realized he had stopped breathing. Only when she had touched him, she had known. His body temperature had already cooled down. Dr. Murray's call had devastated her, but finding her beloved companion gone, she had finalized her decision. Life was often cruel and unfair, but she could change all that now. Why wait until the pain became unbearable, and why consider to wither away in a hospice? She had always believed in the afterlife without being overly religious. The idea of meeting the people you had loved once again after your death had always given her hope. She would see Herbert again, and Dr. Whiskers, and old Wanda, who had been a total hoot. She smiled and went to the kitchen counter. She had left one muffin for herself. It waited for her on her favorite porcelain plate with the roses. She spared a quick thought about how she'd want to be found, then decided it didn't matter at all. She sat down at the small table where she had eaten breakfast and lunch with Herb for decades. She missed him and Dr. Whiskers very much. Her sight blurred and her breathing became harder but she took bite after bite. Nothing much would change for her at all, but things would be a lot better for many families. Kyle would be reunited with his wife, and Toby would have his mom back. It would be like waking up in a better world for all of them. Her head dropped into the crumbs left on the plate, and she closed her eyes.
Thank you so much for that, Nick. Well done. Okay, we've got 2 chaps left. I just averted my eyes in case there's any suggestion of any skullduggery. Penultimate reader, Isaac Parker. Isaac Parker is a fantasy writer in the midst of creating his first novel. He enjoys mixing humour with darkness in as tight a space as possible, shoving them in a broom cupboard and seeing what twisted creature is born. While the novel takes shape, Isaac also writes short stories and is reading from one of those tonight. You can follow him on Instagram at Isaac J. Parker. Another member of one of my writing groups, please everyone give Isaac a huge round of applause.
Thanks, Vic, and thanks everyone for coming along tonight and having listened. Everyone's been really good so far. Yeah, so this is the first fantasy crime I've given a go at, and it follows 2 characters, Bert, who writes fraudulent death warrants, and his partner in crime, Gunny, who chops people's heads off. So here we go. Oh yeah, and there is also mild, moderate swearing and reference to bodily functions. "What do you think they've done to the king?" asked Gunny. She asked, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted someone to share in the misery of knowing it. "Oh, I don't know. Dismembered, disemboweled, discouraged from the living, something like that," I said. She made a huffing sound as she fought sleep on her wooden pallet, with a dirty blanket that couldn't decide which half of her to keep warm. Her large, pale shins teetered over the edge of the makeshift bed. "You don't sound worried," she said with a bear-like yawn. "I bet you think this is funny." "Of course I'm worried," I lied, throwing my hands up. "We have no food, no work. Half the people in this city think the king is dead and want his throne, and the other half think he's alive and want him dead." Satisfied that she wasn't alone in her anxieties, she relaxed under the blanket and yawned again. "You don't really think he's gone, do you?" she said. I was convinced the king was not only gone, but all traces of his reign removed. But as any considerate liar would do, I tapped my nose and gave her a look, as if I, a king's scribe, would somehow be in the know. She relented under the weight of her eyelids and began to snore, reassured. I unstuck the smile from my face and thanked God she had finally shut up. I blew out the candle on her side of the room and returned to my table. On the way, I picked up a spatula from the pile of unwashed dishes and sat at the bench to work the itch that had haunted the very centre of my back all night. Crusty gravy gave my scratching tool that little bit more effectiveness. I always lied for Gunny, and always for her own good. She was scared that our city had fallen into the depths of depravity and self-destruction, so rather than remind her it had merely sunken deeper, I pretended to share her anxieties to make her feel better. In reality, stuck in our shack on the edge of town, hiding from the rest of the city's population for my own health was really just my day-to-day. And as with every day, I sat at my bench, half-dressed, ready to write death warrants on behalf of the king who Gunny admired, the king who gave her reassurance, security, and a job, the king who had almost certainly been strung up by his gizzards. I sat bored and realized that in my haste to shut her up, I had encouraged my only source of entertainment to go to sleep. Her snores kept me occupied for a bit, as I imagined smothering them with her ridiculous tiny blanket. But she was a light sleeper, and I was a minnow bunking with a bench-pressing elephant. My table was empty, other than a few drafts I'd done before work had dried up. I twisted my back to give my spatula better access to the sweet spot, and turned the latest death warrant towards me. It was one of 3 the king had ordered before losing his crown and the head that sat under it. As I looked at my beautiful calligraphy and the fine brush strokes illustrating the king's intended victim, a sadness fell over me. King Oten would never see his commission, and I would never be paid. It was a family thing. My father, who was called Bert, had written death warrants, and his father, Bert, had done the same. His father, Bert, had also occupied the role, along with all the Berts prior. Apparently, we'd been nobles of some sort long ago, locked in an agreement with the current royal lineage that should anyone need beheading, we Berts would get to be the first to tell everyone. But that lineage had dried up and so taken our employer with it. To be honest, if he'd handed out a few more warrants for me to draw up, he might have killed the ringleaders of the rebellion before it got started. But no, he'd been a kind king, a restrained king, only ordering executions when absolutely necessary. But now he was kind of dead and restrained in a coffin, if he was lucky. I laughed at my clever wordplay and put my feet up on the other end of the bench. My back suitably scratched, I used the spatula to squash a roach on the table. Resting my head back on the bench, I fell asleep to the taste of cockroach, the smell of Gunny's extinguished candle, and the sounds of a city tearing itself apart. Our hovel was a mess the next morning, or at least my side was. Gunny tried her best to stay clean, but my half of detritus would overtake her eventually. I liked to languish in cast-off chicken bones, used bowls, and smelly clothes. I'm convinced Gunny would enjoy a good languishing too, if she didn't spend every morning like a panicked robin, bouncing between the walls. This time it was that very detritus that had sent her into a spiral of anxiety. Not exactly my fault though. If she weren't so worked up about the mess, it wouldn't stop her from cleaning it up. I maintained my calm and collected self as she screamed at me all morning, called me a slob, a wretched nugget, a bubo upon the armpit of her life, before she gave up and sat on her pallet in a huff. If she wanted to clean, she could clean, didn't bother me, just as long as she kept the noise down while I took a dump, is apparently what I shouldn't have said. Somehow, and I'm not sure why, this pushed Gunny over the edge. She stomped over to the door and hurled it open. It made a deafening thud and fell off its hinges in shock. If you're going to be so disgusting, why don't you do your business outside and bring the filth back in with you when you're done, she yelled. I waved at our neighbour, Slim Pete, as he passed by our newly designed porch, pretending not to watch our domestic. He used to be called Fat Pete, but famine does terrible things to your waistline. I considered this an omen and wondered if breakfast would help calm the situation down. I stood up and walked over to where broth bubbled over our fire. It wouldn't be ready for a while, but I picked up a ladle and pretended to enjoy it. Pouring some into a bowl, I offered her a taste, but she looked at me with even greater disgust. I'm not eating that, she said, crossing her arms like a child. It's good for you, I said. It's got everything you need, protein, carbs, a bit of timber. Timber, she asked. You don't eat timber. You use timber to build houses and gallows. What, you want me to chew on a dove joint? Chicken might be easier to get a hold of, I didn't say. As if sensing my sarcasm, she knocked the bowl out of my hand and onto the table next to me. Hot broth spilled over my knee. I'm not eating it, she said again. You're all skin and bones, I said, trying to appeal to her neuroses and rescuing a half-boiled millipede before it hit the floor. I'd spent weeks telling her she was too skinny, looking pale, when actually she could have beaten and then consumed every soldier in the king's army and still had strength left over to wrestle a bull. But you put a seed of doubt in someone's mind, and eventually it'll grow into a tree of opportunity. At that moment, I needed an opportunity to prevent further damage to the furniture. Honestly, just try it. I need someone to test it, make sure it's ready, and not deadly, I didn't say. It'll never be ready for human consumption, Bert. I saw you drop beetles in there. Not just beetles, I replied with a grin. Found this big boy too. Somehow the millipede still wriggled, and I threw it back into the pot. She looked like she was about to throw up. Now don't puke, I said, putting the bowl down. Who knows how much more weight loss your body will be able to take? I'm fine, she said, but I won't be if I eat that shit. I picked the bowl up and slammed it back down for effect. And what else are you going to eat? What? You've got your own private supply of fresh bread, wine, and smelly cheese hidden somewhere in this hovel? You'll not be able to work much longer if you don't keep fed. And in case you hadn't noticed, the nearest available food source for the carnivores of this city has become our rotting neighbours. You want to stay strong or be next on the menu? It was amazing how small you could make someone feel, despite their 200% height advantage. You don't have to be a carnivore to eat, was all she could come up with in reply. No, but you have to eat. Now sit down and have a bowl. I filled our only bowl with the thick and, yes, I admit, slimy contents of the pot hanging over the fire. It didn't smell too bad, but that may have just been relative to our shack. I had a wooden board by the door, well, ex-door, with the carving days since cleaned. I was very proud of how many tally marks there were on that board. She sat down with a thump and sighed heavily. And anyway, she said, I don't have a job. You don't have a job. No word from the king for weeks. I don't know what's happened to all our clients, Bert. We have a competitor, Gunny, I said, stopping short of an eye roll. Tears welled in her eyes. I'm not asking for much, Bert. I just want to get out of this shack and get on with work before we're replaced. Say what you will about Gunny, and I've said a great deal, but her work was her life. She defined herself by it and found value in doing the king's dirty work. She was always polite, always comforting, or at least as comforting as you could be to someone about to die. For a woman who could remove your head with or without a sharp implement, she was incredibly soft. Even when a client tried to run away, she was the most gentle person in the city. And then, with the client nice and settled in, their head on the block, she became the most lethal person in the city. We won't be replaced, Gunny. I stepped over the remnants of our front door and gestured outside. A pedestrian dropped dead, 3 arrows stuck in his back and both arms detached at the shoulders. Further down, we heard the screams of someone dying from the plague, or worse, the doctor trying to cure it. More like made redundant, I said. I walked back to the contents of the bowl, picked it up and handed it to her. You chop people's heads off for a living, dear. Between rebellions, famine, plague and regicide, the city is doing your job for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Isaac. Okay, we have one reader left, and just to prove, yep, there's some more bits of me hat falling off. Lovely, excellent. Susan, come on. We've got Alex Caan. Alex Caan has spent over a decade working in information systems security for a number of government organisations and is currently specialising in terrorism studies. So basically, Alex is like our very own James Bond this evening. He is the author of the Kindle #1 bestseller Cut to the Bone, woo, which was picked as a W.H. Smith Everyone's Talking About Book of the Week, chosen as Sainsbury's Best of Summer Reads, and was Angela Marston's pick for crime novel recommendation of the year. Woo! The follow-up, First to Die, was released in 2018, but in 2019, Alex changed tack and wrote the steamy bonkbuster Bollywood Wives, another Kindle #1 bestseller. Woo! His latest book is Back to Crime with The Unbroken, introducing 2 female Muslim detectives. Alex is also part of the Red Hot Chili Writers podcast. So everybody, our final reader for this evening, Alex Caan.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Sorry, okay. Can you all hear me okay and see me? Brilliant. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to read from my new book. It's called The Unbroken. It's out in Kindle, so that's the cover on my phone if you can see it. It's introducing 2 new detectives, like Vic said. So it's yeah, something I wanted to write for quite a while, but I think it just took me a long time to find the right editor and publisher to take the risk. So yeah, and I'm going to read from chapter 2. This is introducing a character called Mimi Caan. She's someone I actually wrote about 10 years ago, but it was kind of like a short piece, and I didn't quite know where to put her. But then when I was writing this novel, it really fit that actually she was this really wild child who's kind of like turned her back on, you know, her past and her family and everything. So yeah, so I'm just going to read her introduction. There is swearing as well. Apologies. Okay. Don't fucking come near me. I've got mace. Mimi was looking for her keys on her knees, scrabbling around in pebbles and bits of weed. It was 3 a.m. The Edgware Road traffic at an unusual lull. She kept looking at the entrance to her mansion block, hoping someone from one of the flats would go for a late night walk or come home. She couldn't be the only person out so late. Maybe she was. Stuffy posh twat. When she saw him for the first time, she thought he was going to mug her. She was pissed, tired, shoeless. How did that happen? And technically homeless, and he was a random guy who had come out of nowhere. But where were her shoes? She saw the shock on his face, and after she screamed at him, "Get the fuck away from me." She needed a lock on her mouth. It didn't help he stayed silent, until he jangled some keys, and then she guessed he lived here. He opened the communal entrance. He would have been right to slam it after himself. Luckily for her, he didn't. She tried to stagger to the door, but tripped over herself, as she was still sprawled on the floor and didn't realise it. Bucket, she hurried in, the warmth of the block hitting her exposed flesh. The red strapless number had seemed like a good idea at 7 p.m. to make an entrance to the hottest Chelsea bars and clubs, where she was meeting her girls. Not so good when she was fuzzy-headed. Maybe someone had given her a hypnol. She couldn't remember. She didn't see where the man went. She lived in the basement, but she rode the stairs down to the flat like she used to ride the stairs back home. Hump, hump, hump. She got to her front door by crawling and then passed out. Her last thought was, where are my fucking shoes? It was still dark when she woke up. No, that wasn't true. She was woken up. The man's face looming in at her. Are you okay? He was saying. American accent. He looked quite cute from this angle. Fuck, she was a mess. He must think she was a lush. He might be her neighbour, but he might still be a rapist or murderer or something. No, they had CCTV. He wouldn't get away with it. Yes, she muttered. Do you live alone? Why did he want to know? The adrenaline in a fight always came before flight in Mumi's case. Look, she said. You look pretty ill. You got anyone to look after you tonight? Look, he looked like Will Smith. She was becoming lucid, could feel her limbs again, feel them bent out of shape. I'm fine, she managed. It sounded distant. Okay, if you say so. The super ain't here, so if you get stuck, you can sleep on my couch. In case your keys are... He gestured out behind him and above him. Apartment 305, third floor. I'll be up for a while. Third floor, he repeated. I'm fine, she said. Okay, like I said. He went away. Mumi slumped against her front door, went to sleep again. It was breaking dawn when she first woke up. She tried banging on the building manager's door, but no one answered. She had no keys. Her spare set was in the office. There was no way she was getting an Uber down to Pop. Actually, Sara had a set too. Mumi texted her, asked her to drop them off in the morning. Mumi decided she needed a slash. What was that guy's apartment? Shit, third floor. She couldn't remember that much. Where were her shoes? How could she lose her shoes? Was she that? What had gotten into her last night? Well, last night. Was that right? Harry, bastard. Even now, the thought of him brought tears to her eyes. She hated him. Yes, she did. She wanted her mum. No, she didn't. Mumtaz wanted her mum. And Mumtaz was dead and fucking buried. Mumi was who she was now, and Mumi didn't want anything to do with that cow. The elevator pinged when she got to the third floor. She was trembling, the morning cold affecting her limbs even inside the building. The doors to the different apartments all looked the same. The velvet carpet felt good though. Where would she start? She leaned against each apartment door, listening in, seeing if some background noise like TV or music would give him away. She got a mad dog barking at her behind one door, but she nearly jumped out of her skin, so she kicked that door. That was clever. He lived a couple of doors down and opened his front door after promotion. Found it then. Yes. Can I use your facilities? Sure. She looked around warily in a sparse, modernist flat, trying to plan an escape route, identify weapons. His toilet was in the same location as her. She caught sight of her face in his bathroom mirror after she was done, recoiled, decided a freshly scrubbed look would be better than the Joker look she had acquired. She pinched her nipples before she left the bath. He was chatting on MSN when she found him. She had used his toothpaste and even dabbed on his cologne. Her feet didn't bear thinking about, collecting debris like they were. Where were her shoes? Maybe she shouldn't stand on his carpet. She felt more awake though. Thanks, she said. No problem, he said, turning away from his chat windows. I'm Mumi. Jake, he said. He held out his hand. It felt cool and strong as she shook it. You're American, she said, feeling dumb straight away. He knew he was, obviously. Which part? Desperate to redeem herself. I'm from LA. No one's from LA. People just move there to be movie stars. I really am. Grew up around Crenshaw. Thought that was Korean. You been? Then how would you know? I'm from LA. And you? I don't think you are, she said. You're quite opinionated for a drunk lady, he said. I sober fast when I'm in a strange man's apartment. I'll make you some coffee. You got any brandy for that coffee? He didn't answer. She texted Sara, told her she was okay, out of friends. Keys could wait. I think the coffee might be better black, he said. I think there's enough alcohol in your system, probably. Sorry, who died and made you my dad? He ignored her, got her straight coffee. How old are you? She said. 28. Yourself? 27. The unlucky number. What do you mean? Janis Joplin, Amy Winehouse? Although I think most of my life has been pretty shitty. He didn't reply. He wasn't her therapist. She sucked in the coffee. Mumi wasn't sure who made the first move. She liked to think it wasn't her. She knew this was a lie, though. One moment they were talking about post-Trump America, and then she was asking him about his school, girlfriend, sex. Then they were exchanging saliva and looking for condoms. He warmed her croissants while she showered. She was lightheaded and sober when they ate together on the sofa in his room awkwardly. This is why you didn't stay after the shag. The phone rang as she had a croissant halfway to her mouth. Encryption number showing on health screen. Work. Detective Sergeant Mimi Caan, she said seriously. The look on Jake's face.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to stay with you for a sec there, Alex. Sharon Birch would like to know, how do you go from crime to bonkbusters, and weren't you tempted to kill people off?
There is actually a murder even in the Bunkbuster.
Nice.
So yeah, basically. It was just a passion of mine. I just wanted to always, I was a big fan of people like Jackie Collins and Julie Cooper when I was growing up. So I kind of got the opportunity to write something in that vein, and I took it. So yeah.
Excellent. And will we be seeing more bonkbusters?
Yeah.
Awesome. Brilliant. Thank you so much for that.
No worries. Thank you.
Oh, okay, everyone. That is the end of number 4, Noir at the Bar, or Virtual Noir at the Bar. As always, a few things to try and keep you entertained this week. The Facebook group UK Crime Book Club is holding a mini festival at the beginning of May with a number of panels. The big names that are taking part include Ellie Griffiths, Mark Billingham, Callie Taylor and William Shaw. Not blowing our own trumpet here, but some of those people might be appearing in the coming weeks as well. As always, William Shaw's Facebook page, he does something every day at 4 o'clock, speaks to people in the industry, writers, editors, just people in the know, and it's always just a lovely conversation, lovely chat, and he's just a fab man. So join in at 4 o'clock if you can, but if not, I think you can rewatch on Facebook as well. Our very own Dr. Noir is taking Newcastle Noir virtual. Jackie Collins will be shining a spotlight on several big named authors from the 1st to the 3rd of May, which is when we should have all been meeting at Newcastle Central Library. So you can tune into those spotlight author chats using the Newcastle Noir Facebook page and Newcastle Library's Facebook page. And obviously I would heartily recommend it. Thank you to everybody who's donated tonight. Somebody left a message saying we need a bigger bar, and I think we are going to need a bigger bar very soon, especially week on week. More people are attending, and that's great, and more authors are coming. We've actually got people scheduled up until August now, so please do come back every week. But also thank you very much for your donations, just to keep the bar open and make it a little bit bigger. We will be selecting winners of free ebooks. You're not too late though, so if you want to drop an email to that email address with the subject line enter, please do so sooner rather than later. Thank you to our chat bouncer, Nikki Black. I don't think she's had to do any bouncing tonight. I think you've all been really well behaved. Even though somebody called Courtney seemed to have been, you know, harassing Isaac a little bit, but I think she's let that slide. Thank you to all of our writers who've joined us tonight. You're all fab. Thank you to everybody who's watched. I know we've had some viewers from America and Europe as well. And like I say, there is a very special American guest joining us next Wednesday. Thank you, as always, to Simon Bewick, who is keeping the lights on in the bar, keeping everything working in the bar, because I'm the biggest technophobe ever. So not only has he been a fab reader tonight, but he's also kept the show on the road. None of this would be possible without him, and none of it would be worth doing without any of you joining us every Wednesday. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming, and I hope to see you next week. I would just like to make one final thank you to 2 of our readers this week. They both work for the NHS and they've both joined us this week as well. So Suzy Aspley and Alex Caan are doing amazing work. In addition to being phenomenal writers, they're doing really super important work. So thank you very much to both of them and to all of our NHS workers. Have a brilliant week, everybody. Stay safe, and I'll see you next Wednesday. Thank you.